Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change and just an update on the kitten saga. I got it out of the garage last night. Let me clarify, for most of you who were commenting about me making a video while the cat was meowing. So what was happening was I was talking, making the video, and the cat would start meowing, and I would stop and go look for the cat and try to figure out what was going on. And as soon as I stopped the video, the cat would just go completely dead silent, making it very difficult to figure out what was going on. So I did that about 8 times through the video, tried to find the cat, tried to figure out where the cat was, tried to, get the cat out of wherever it was stuck at. And I didn't even know the cat was in the garage until the end of the video, if you watch the video. So anyways, that was what was going on. I wasn't just like, screw that cat, just let it meow and suffer. And by the way, it's a feral cat. It's a wild cat. It's not a house cat. It's not a tame cat. Don't ever try to make a tame cat or a house cat out of a feral cat. It doesn't work. I tried that once. They will bite and scratch the ever-living shit out of you. So don't do it. They don't want to be tamed. They are wild animals. So I have these wild cats that live in the back. I let them run wild. I do not feed them because you don't want to do that. So that's what's up with the cats. Just to clarify, so y'all don't think I'm just some kind of animal abuser, whatever. Nothing of the sort. Anyways, moving on to climate change. Things to consider. Many, many things to consider. Let's start with 2 major storms in the Pacific, which was brought to my attention by Robert Scribbler's channel. Say what you want about Robert Scribbler, and many people have many things to say about Robert Scribbler. He is doing quite a lot of work as far as just alerting people to what is going on. And he's keeping his finger on the pulse of a lot of like everyday climate events that I wouldn't actually otherwise find because they're not easily findable. Anyways, this is from the Washington Post. 2 monster tropical cyclones are raging in the Pacific Ocean, Kong Ray and Walaka. For the first time in more than a decade, Earth fueled 2 Category 5 equivalent storms early Tuesday. These 2 behemoths are located on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean basin, Hurricane Walaka to the northeast and Super Typhoon Kong Ray to the west. Early Tuesday, both tempests packed winds over 157 miles per hour, becoming the first duo to achieve Category 5 winds simultaneously since 2005. What are the chances of that? The 2 storms weakened very slightly by Tuesday afternoon, dropping back to a Category 4. Walaka has winds up to 150 miles per hour, a mere 7 miles per hour below the Category 5 threshold, located about 400 miles west of Honolulu. Walaka has prompted a high surf advisory for nearly everyone in the Hawaiian archipelago but the Big Island. Waves of 12 to 16 feet are possible. The storm is far enough away that Hawaii will avoid more direct effects. While Walaka Center is far from any inhabited land, the National Hurricane Center has issued a dire warning for the Johnston Atoll, a wildlife refuge that is unincorporated and administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The 0 population 4-island territory makes up a mere 1.3 square miles, but is likely to sustain a direct hit from a 140 mile per hour eyewall. The former military base was once used as a nuclear weapons testing site and a place to store dioxin-loaded Agent Orange. Are there any more remnants of nuclear waste there? I wonder. Averaged globally, about 5 storms worldwide achieve Category 5 status annually, according to a tweet by Ryan Mao, of weathermodels.com. About a quarter of all major tropical cyclones equivalent to Category 3 or stronger make it to Category 5. That said, Walaka appears to mainly be a storm for the fish. Despite an exceptionally low surface air pressure, about the same as the top of Oahu, the vacuum-like cyclone won't pose much of a threat to land. By Wednesday, it is expected to begin a rapid weakening trend. Kong Ray, meanwhile, has also briefly tempered to Category 4 status. About 300 miles east-northeast of Manila, the massive typhoon features sustained winds of 155 miles per hour and gusts to 190 miles per hour. The storm is projected to gradually weaken over the next 4 days, arriving in South Korea as an 85 mile per hour cyclone Saturday. Kong Ray is a sparky storm with considerable lightning activity being picked up on its southern eyewall. The Korea Meteorological Administration estimates at least a 70% chance that Seoul will encounter gusts up to hurricane force by the weekend. Odd as it may seem, things could be worse. On September 11th, 1961, 3 simultaneous Category 5s roamed 2 ocean basins. Carla spun mischievously across the Atlantic, while Pamela and Nancy cranked through the Pacific. It has been an exceptionally active year for storms in the Northeast Pacific Ocean. 9 major hurricanes rated Category 3 or higher have formed, tied for the most on record. The ocean basin has racked up more than double the amount of accumulated cyclone energy it would normally see by this time of year. All right, more storms, more hurricanes. How many typhoons have already hit the Far East? A major amount, an eye-opening amount. And so we're going to move to this article. I think this is the last thing that was posted on Arctic News. This is from September 24th, looking the climate abyss in the eye. This is very short, so I'm going to just run through this. Growth of CO2 in the atmosphere is accelerating. The image shows the growth rate in parts per million based on annual Mauna Loa data, with a 4th-order polynomial trend added. Moving up to what? I mean, just going up quite a bit. I'm not sure about the parts per million part. While no data are yet available for the year 2018, the trend on above image points at 2.65 parts per million. Oh, growth, I guess, per year. The image below shows the level for the most recent week, which is 2.53 parts per million above the corresponding week a year ago. So sometime before 2030, it will be growing 3.5 and above parts per million a year. Carl Rasmussen calculates that the deseasonalized growth rate has now, at the middle of 2018, reached a plus 2.3 parts per million a year. Carl adds the rate of growth itself growing. It is the highest growth rate ever seen in modern times. This is not just a business as usual scenario. It is worse than that. We're actually moving backward, becoming more and more unstable with every year. This shows unequivocally that the efforts undertaken so far to limit greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide are woefully inadequate. Even more alarming is the growth in methane. Peak methane levels were as high as 3.37 parts per million on August 31, 2018, an ominous warning of the threat of destabilization of the methane hydrates at the seafloor of the Arctic Ocean. Mean global methane levels were as high as 1.91 parts per million on the morning of September 20th, 2018 at 293 millibar. This is a level unprecedented in human history, and it far exceeds the WMO database trend added on the right of above image. Temperatures look set for a steep rise within years, as we now are fully in the danger zone. Meanwhile, the IPCC seeks to downplay the amount of global warming that has already occurred, and that looks set to eventuate over the next decade or so. The image on the right shows the full extent of climate abyss we are facing, and shows potential for 10 C of global temperature rise by 2026, which is 10 C is certain death for everybody you know and everybody they know. Probably at 4 or 5 C, that's certain death for everybody you know and I know and they know. Meanwhile, the IPCC seeks to downplay the amount of global warming that has already occurred, and that looks set to eventuate. Right. Have a look at the extinction page for more details on the full extent of the threat. How many people and species will survive the coming temperature rise? Excuse me, we don't know. The best we can do is to support climate action, i.e. action that starts immediately, and that is transformative, comprehensive, and effective as described in the climate plan. But first, you have to manually empty the brains of all the people in power and replace them with brains that work. So no climate plan, however thorough or well thought out, is ever going to do anything unless that plan includes how to knock some idiots upside the head and make them think, by gum, or make them less greedy, or whatever, etc., etc. So we're getting a little bit of a rainstorm, which is kind of awesome. It's not a storm. I wouldn't call it a storm. We're getting some rain, and it's just kind of drizzly and not really coming down very hard yet, but I will take it. My plants will take it. The trees will take it. We are in really bad need of rain right now. The trees looking as bad as they do in Los Angeles. Any of the ones that are half alive or still alive are going to need every drop this winter. So I'm hoping we get something. Moving on to this article from the Washington Post. This is from a few days ago, actually a few weeks ago. Let's see, maybe about 2 weeks ago. At this rate, Earth risks sea level rise of 20 to 30 feet, historical analysis shows. This is by Chris Mooney. Temperature is not much warmer than the planet is experiencing now. We're sufficient to melt a major part of the East Antarctic ice sheet in Earth's past, scientists reported Wednesday, including during one era about 125,000 years ago, when sea levels were as much as 20 to 30 feet higher than they are now. It doesn't need to be a very big warming as long as it stays 2 degrees warmer for a sufficient time. This is the end game, said David Wilson, geologist at the Imperial College London and one of the authors of the new research, which was published in Nature. Scientists at institutions in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Spain also contributed to the work. The research concerns a little-studied region called the Wilkes Subglacial Basin, which is roughly the size of California and Texas combined and contains more than 10 feet of potential sea level rise, fronted by 3 enormous glaciers named Cook, Mertz, and Ninnis. The Wilkes is known to be vulnerable to fast retreat because the ice here is not standing on land and instead is rising up from a deep depression in the ocean floor. Moreover, the depression grows deeper as you move from the current icy coastline of the Wilkes farther inland toward the South Pole, a downhill slope that could facilitate rapid ice loss. What the new science adds is that during past warm periods in Earth's history, some or all of the ice in the Wilkes Subglacial Basin, oh my God, there's an actual large cat back here, but I don't know what she's doing. Not meowing, thank God. What the new science adds is that during past warm periods in Earth's history, some or all of the ice in the Wilkes subglacial basin seems to have gone away. That's an inference researchers made by studying the record of sediments in the seafloor just off the coast of the current ice front. Here, they found several layers of sediments that appear to come from beneath where the ice currently lies, providing a hint that when these layers of the seafloor were laid down, Wilkes contained either less ice or no ice at all. Those sediments corresponded in time to several well-known past warm periods when seas rose considerably. But what's worrying is that these eras were in many cases not much warmer than the planet already is right now. Humans have caused about 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit of warming above the pre-industrial planetary temperatures experienced before the year 1880 or so. The world has pledged to avoid a warming above 2 degrees Celsius and even hopes to hold a warming to 1.5 degrees, but current promises made by countries are not nearly enough to prevent these outcomes. In other words, we are already on a course that could heat the planet enough to melt some or all of the Wilkes Basin. We say 2 degrees beyond pre-industrial, and we're already beyond pre-industrial, Wilson said. So this is potentially the kinds of temperatures we could see this century. The study cannot reveal, however, just how quickly ice emptied out of the Wilkes Basin. The past warm periods in question are thought to have been driven by slight variations in Earth's orbit as it rotates around the sun, leading to stronger summer heat. That warmth was maintained for thousands of years. What we definitely can say is that during the geological stages where temperatures were warm for a couple of degrees, for a couple of millennia, this is where we see a distinct signature in our records, Wilson said. We can't necessarily say things didn't happen quick, but we can't resolve that in our data. The new research contributes to the mounting pile of evidence that East Antarctica is not as stable as we thought. Isabella Belliconia, a glaciologist at the University of California, Irvine, said by email. Belliconia was not directly involved in the paper. What I found particularly interesting is that the authors came to their conclusions using data record offshore, not directly beneath the ice, which would be ideal, but this is clearly putting more incentive into studying this part of the East Antarctica in more detail. This new research comes just as the US and British governments prepare to launch a multi-year research project to study Antarctica's huge and remote Thwaites Glacier, which is in West Antarctica, and is viewed as the largest risk to coastlines in this century. The situations of Thwaites and Wilkes are eerily similar. Both feature enormous amounts of ice resting on the seafloor rather than on land, and downward slopes that create what scientists call a marine ice sheet instability. And both contain enough ice to unlock 10 feet or more of sea level rise. Thwaites is sitting on a very unfortunate spot. One moment, please. Sitting on an unfortunate spot resting over some of the deepest bedrock in West Antarctica, Ted Scambos, a senior research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado, said at a planning event at Columbia University on Wednesday, the new study suggests that Thwaites is the beginning, not the end of our worries. One key difference, though, is that Thwaites is already losing 50 billion tons of ice per year, whereas the Wilkes region appears to be relatively unchanged for now, according to Wilson. But it may simply be that while the world is already warm enough to awaken West Antarctica, just a bit more warmth will cause the same to happen to parts of the much larger East Antarctic ice sheet. That would not only explain a lot about the link between past sea levels and past temperatures in Earth's history, it would further illuminate the future we're heading towards. Moving on, someone linked like a podcast from Tim Garrett on Radio EcoShock. If y'all don't know who Tim Garrett is, he is the guy that Guy McPherson always quotes as saying civilization is a heat engine. I'm going to link the article, but I'm just going to, there's a little text here along with the podcast. So I'm going to read some of that. There's actually quite a bit of text. I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to read through some of it. Dr. Tim Garrett, the new 2018 interview this week, what do we talk about? Generally, I break the discussion into two main themes. Tim's work as an atmospheric scientist on understanding clouds, and in this interview, the role of clouds in the Arctic in particular, and the way Garrett applies theory from physics to understand our economy and prediction of our troubled future. So let's just go through a little bit about clouds. We all know that climate change is happening on steroids in the Arctic, where warming is much more extreme than anywhere else on the globe. The Arctic winter is now warmer, and so are the seas. The season for the sea ice is shorter. Summer sea ice may disappear entirely soon, except around a few Canadian islands. Greenland is melting, and some summer days in the far north feel more like the tropics. In 2018, we saw summer heat waves in Siberia and Alaska. What does that all mean for clouds in the Arctic? And are clouds affecting climate change there or even globally? We discussed that. While we don't know the reaction of clouds to climate change, Garrett suggests if more clouds do form in the Arctic, that could speed up sea ice loss. The cloud cover can act as a blanket reflecting heat from the warming seas back toward the surface. Arctic clouds and pollution. It turns out that Arctic clouds are unusually sensitive to pollution. As Garrett shows in a new paper, pollution blows up from mid-latitudes where most of us live. I recommend the research team found that clouds in the Arctic were 2 to 8 times more sensitive to air pollution than clouds at other latitudes. They don't know for sure why yet, but hypothesize it may have to do with the stillness of the Arctic air mass. Without the air turbulence seen at mid-latitudes, the Arctic air can be easily perturbed by airborne particulates. But secondly, it explains how smog from our tailpipes and factories further south are migrating to the Arctic. The Danish scientists, Jason Box, gave us another illustration of that fact when he showed photos of gray glaciers in Greenland. They should have been sparkling white and bluish, not dark gray. I don't know if you all have seen those photos, but pretty alarming stuff. Surprised about wildfire smoke in Arctic clouds. There was a big surprise for me in all this new science. I know that clouds require some particulate matter to collect moisture from the air, and thus pollution could increase clouds if there is enough water vapor in the atmosphere. I assume that the growing number and size of forest fires in the Great Boreal Forests of Alaska and Canada and Russia could lead to more clouds in the Arctic. Garrett says these fires do lead to a lower level of haze or smog, which he has seen, but investigation shows wildfire smoke has not led to more clouds. Tim Garrett on systems, energy, and collapse. Civilization is at an interesting point. Global wealth is growing faster than ever, but the rate of growth is stagnating for the first time since the 30s. We are all competing for globally constrained growth of 2.2% a year. Is what followed the 30s a guide? He refers to this article published in Earth Systems Dynamics in 2015, as he says in the abstract, that this paper evaluates an alternative economic framework outlined in part 1 of the study that approaches the global economy using purely physical principles rather than explicitly resolved societal dynamics. I'm going to actually have to listen to this podcast, and I'm sorry that I did not. I'm just like reading some text. I'm planning on listening to it tonight, and hopefully will not fall asleep during listening to it, which is very likely. And in that case, then I guess I'll listen to it tomorrow. Tim explains we will consume as much matter and energy in the next 30 years as we have since 1750. As infinite growth is impossible, civilization must either decline or organically or be forced to decline. You cannot find a great You can find a great explanation of this theory in the 4-minute Vimeo. This 4-minute Vimeo, blah. It was extremely difficult to say. I'm sorry. In his 4-minute Vimeo, Garrett is astonished that it took us about 10,000 years to achieve current energy use, but to continue to grow, say 2.4%. We then need to double everything we have, all accumulated over 10,000 years in just 30 years. Even if there were the energy resources to do that, including all the other resources required for that energy extraction and distribution system, what happens to all that carbon waste in our atmosphere? Then, in that dependence on the growth hormone, it all needs to double again in another 30 years. In 60 years, our world consumption of energy and resources would need to quadruple during a period of intense climate heating, possibly up to 5 degrees C. Garrett concludes something has to give. I wonder what it is. In several places, Tim suggests we may revisit a system-wide depression like the 1930s. I'm not sure the 1930s is a good analysis, or that we can reach any historical precedent from where we are now. Maybe the 1930s will seem good or mild compared to the climate-damaged future, or maybe humanity will squeeze into a brand new phase. Something about why green energy either doesn't matter or makes the problem worse. A commentator on Tim's Twitter feed says the premise of Nephalog, the premise of the argument is that civilization is a heat engine and the source of energy to generate growth is ultimately irrelevant to the final outcome. Is Garrett saying that even if we manage to run civilization on solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal, if growth is necessary, we are still doomed to collapse? Apparently so, and as we will see, he is not alone. Tim's tweet of August 15th links to a New York Times article where even climate-aware Germany still depends on coal for up to 40% of its energy. He says historically, new energy sources add to the mix rather than replace their older foundation. That sounds pretty bleak for the future of green energy like solar and wind. I can hear some of my listeners objecting as if our love has been insulted, our dreams broken. At 25 minutes into the show, Garrett essentially says we use green energy to build more civilization, which converts more raw materials into civilization, which needs more energy. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the problem. Or just think about the problem of all of the things going on to create environmental collapse outside of just burning of fossil fuels. Even if we just didn't burn fossil fuels, we will have a carbon dioxide level still rising from our previous burning of fossil fuels, even if we stopped all that today. But even if civilization was still going the way it's going, we would still be polluting everything to death. We would still be clear cutting and industrial farming and doing everything that it is we need to do in order to keep 7 point whatever billion people alive. As long as we are doing that and adding more people, we are going to pollute ourselves to death. We are literally just going to pollute and kill, and we're still going to drive every other species to extinction, maybe slightly before we drive ourselves to extinction. The longtime UK climate activist George Monbiot comes to similar conclusions in a column in the Guardian newspaper called Deathly Silence, published October 1st, 2018. Why am I not reading this? Maybe I'll be reading this next. I don't know what time it is. What time is it? Do I have time to read this? Let's check in with the clock. Ooh, it's getting late. We're getting there, aren't we? We're making the transition towards an all-electric future. We can now leave fossil fuels in the ground and thwart climate breakdown, or so you might imagine if you follow the technology news. All right, so I'm going to stop reading this Tim Garrett thing and just jump over to this article by George Monbiot. Deathly Silence. How's that for a creepy title? We need to get embarrassing about climate breakdown. And to quote something I read in another article or heard in another space, something about somebody saying we have to make difficult choices about how we live. I think it was a Robert Hunziker article. Indeed, difficult choices about how we live must be made and will be made for us, whether we make them or not. Again, we're getting there, aren't we? We're making the transition towards an all-electric future. We can now leave fossil fuels in the ground and thwart climate breakdown. Or so you might imagine if you follow the technology news. So how come oil production for the first time in history is about to hit 100 million barrels per day? How come the oil industry expects demand to climb until the 2030s? How is it that in Germany, whose energy transition, Energiewende, or Energiewende, was supposed to be a model for the world, protesters are being beaten up by police as they try to defend the 12,000-year-old Hombacher forest from an open-cast mine extracting lignite, the dirtiest form of coal. Why have investments in Canadian tar sands, the dirtiest source of oil, doubled in the past year? The answer is growth. There might be more electric vehicles on the world's roads, but there are also more internal combustion engines. There might be more bicycles, but there are also more planes. It doesn't matter how many good things we do. Preventing climate breakdown means ceasing to do bad things. Given that economic growth in nations, and I would say even ceasing to do the good things, right? Like instead of building these energy transition things, we need to just stop. I am officially a neo-Luddite, by the way. I love technology and I do love the internet and all that, but as far as, but I'm wholly against what technology is doing to the planet. So, I am a user of technology. I'm not a friend of technology on any level. Anyways, hoppity boo. Where did I go? Where did I stop? Given that economic growth in nations that are already rich enough to meet the needs of all requires the growth of pointless consumption, it is hard to see how it can ever be decoupled from the assault on the living planet. When a low-carbon industry expands within a growing economy, the money it generates stimulates high-carbon industry. Anyone who works in this field knows environmental entrepreneurs, eco-consultants, and green business managers who use their earnings to pay for holidays in distant parts of the world and the flights required to get there. Electric vehicles have driven a new resource rush, particularly for lithium that is already polluting rivers and trashing precious wild spaces. Clean growth is as much of an oxymoron as clean coal, but making this obvious statement in public life is treated as political suicide. The Labour Party's new environmental policy published this week rightly argues that our current economic model is threatening the foundations on which human well-being depends. It recognizes that ecological collapse cannot be prevented through consumer choice or corporate social responsibility. The response to our greatest predicament must be determined by scientific research and planned, coordinated, and led by government. It pledges to meet the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global temperature rises to no more than 1.5 C. Ha ha. But as almost everyone does, it ignores the fundamental problem. Beyond a certain point, economic growth, the force that lifted people out of poverty, Cure deprivation, squalor, and disease tips us back into those conditions. To judge by the devastation climate breakdown is wreaking, we appear already to have reached this point. The contradiction is most obvious when the policy document discusses airports, an issue on which the party is divided. Labor guarantees that any airport expansion adheres to our tests on climate change. But airport expansion is incompatible with its climate commitments. Even if aircraft emissions are capped at 2005 levels, by 2050 they will account for half the nation's carbon budget. If the UK is not to contribute to more than 1.5 C of global warming, if airports grow, they will swallow even more of that budget. Airport expansion is highly regressive, offending the principles of justice and equity that labor exists to uphold. Regardless of the availability and costs of flights, they are used disproportionately by the rich, as these are the people with the business meetings in New York, the second homes in Tuscany, and the money to pay for winter holidays in the sun. Yet the impacts, noise, pollution, and climate breakdown are visited disproportionately on the poor. I recognize that challenging our least contested ideologies ideologies, growth, and consumerism is a tough call. But in New Zealand, it is beginning to happen. Jacinda Ardern, the Labour Prime Minister, says it will no longer be good enough to say a policy is successful because it increases GDP if it also degrades the physical environment. How this translates into policy and whether her party will resolve its own contradictions remains to be determined. No politician can act without support. If we want political parties to address these issues, we too must start addressing them. We cannot rely on the media to do it for us. A report by the research group Media Matters found that total coverage of climate change across 5 U.S. news networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, and PBS, amounted to 260 minutes in 2017, a little over 4 hours. Almost all of it was a facet of the Trump psychodrama. Will he pull out of the Paris Accord? What's he gone and done this time, rather than the treatment of climate chaos in its own right? There was scarcely a mention of the link between climate breakdown and the multiple unnatural disasters in the U.S. The U.S. suffered that year. A few findings of new findings in climate science, or the impacts of new pipelines or coal mines. I cannot find a comparable recent study in the UK. I suspect it is little better, but not a lot. A little better, but not a lot. The worst denial is not the claim that this existential crisis isn't happening. It is a failure to talk about it at all. Not talking about our great predicament, even as it starts to bite, requires a constant and determined effort. Taken as a whole, of course, there are exceptions. The media is a threat to humanity. Let me read that again. Taken as a whole, the media is a threat to humanity. It claims to speak on our behalf, but it either speaks against us or does not speak at all. So what do? We talk. As the climate writer Joe Romm argued on Think Progress earlier this year, a crucial factor in the remarkable shift in attitudes toward LGBT people was the determination of activists to break the silence. They overcame social embarrassment to broach issues that other people found uncomfortable. Right. We need, Romm argues, to do the same for climate breakdown. A recent survey suggests that 65% of Americans rarely or never discuss it with friends or family, while only 1 in 5 hear people they know mention the subject at least once a month. Like the media, we subconsciously invest great psychological effort into not discussing an issue that threatens almost every aspect of our lives, and that's why people don't want to talk about it. Let's be embarrassing. Let's break the silence, however uncomfortable it makes us and others feel. Let's talk about the great unmentionables, not just climate breakdown, but also growth and consumerism. Let's create the political space in which well-intentioned parties can act. Let us talk a better world into being. Indeed. Even if that's all it is talk, I don't know. It has to start somewhere. But that is the reason why people don't want to talk about it. The main reason, it's not, LGBT acceptance is very different from the end of, or the possible end of life on Earth. I mean, that's the gulf is gigantic. Even though, you know, just people aren't willing to talk about it. People aren't willing to accept it. People aren't willing to take this information on board. I was just making a comment or replying to a comment on, I think, yesterday's video, somebody talking about Robert Scribbler and his inability to take in the message of the doomer crowd, or, you know, NTHE. His actually kind of assault on the doomer, on the doomosphere and on the doomer side of the equation. People just absolutely cannot take on board the idea that we, you know, are facing a very ugly future. You know, that everything is going to be fine if we just, you know, do the right things and say the right things and move everything incrementally forward. And the thing is the incremental forward movement is not happening as fast as the actual hockey stick of abrupt climate change. This is reality. This is happening. This is absolutely going to happen. And this incremental rise, or, you know, incremental so-called cut and burning of fossil fuels is not going to do anything. Is not going to alleviate the problem. So, you know, the problem is extremely ugly. And, you know, if we're even going to have a chance, even if we don't have a chance, but if we're going to have any kind of a chance, we're going to have to talk about some very ugly realities. And we're going to have to talk about very different realities for ourselves. Or we're going to have to, what was the quote? We're going to have to make difficult choices about how we live. We cannot live the way we're living, period, end of story. People are going to have to wrap their minds around not flying for a living, not flying up for vacations, not you know, the dream of whatever it is that you are going to achieve in this lifetime, in this paradigm, is not going to exist in a couple of years. Whether you make that choice on your own or whether that choice is made for you, that choice will not be available in 5 or 10 years. So get your mind around that fact. The sooner you get your mind around that fact, the sooner you can accept, A, this is reality, and then what is the actual next step that needs to be taken. And there, you know, I could go on and on. And I will go on and on because I do this every day. So thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. I don't know how many hours of video that I have made, but on this channel, we do more than 4 hours of climate change coverage a year. We probably do more than 4 hours, maybe in a week or two. So that's our little tiny part for the media world. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, peace.